We have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor. This is, we're all over the world. And we have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away. And the people are suffering and they're dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military option if necessary.
For 25 years, American presidents talked about Venezuela. George W. Bush condemned Chavez. Barack Obama imposed sanctions. Donald Trump, in his first term, recognized Juan Guaido. Joe Biden lifted sanctions, hoping for free elections. And through it all, through every speech, every sanction, every diplomatic maneuver, Nicolás Maduro kept dancing. He danced while his people starved. He danced while 8 million Venezuelans fled. He danced while Russian bombers flew exercises 1,500 miles from Miami. He danced while Chinese loans bought his loyalty. He danced while Cuban intelligence ran his security state. On January 3, 2026, the music stopped. In one night, Donald Trump did what 5 presidents couldn't or wouldn't do. He didn't give a speech. He didn't impose a sanction. He sent Delta Force. And when the sun rose over Caracas, Maduro was on an American warship, heading to a Manhattan courtroom. This is the story of who just lost everything. Not just money, but military bases, intelligence networks, terrorist infrastructure, and 2 decades of strategic positioning. And this is the story of why Donald Trump may have just pulled off the most consequential foreign policy victory since the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you want to understand how power actually works, subscribe now. This is the most important geopolitical story of the decade, and we're covering every angle. Let's be honest about what happened before Trump. In 1999, Hugo Chavez took power in Venezuela. By 2001, he was openly calling the United States the enemy. By 2006, he stood at the United Nations and called George W. Bush the devil. What did Bush do? He gave speeches, the State Department issued condemnations, and Chavez kept consolidating power. Meanwhile, something far more dangerous was happening. Russia began signing oil contracts with PDVSA. China started lending billions. Iran opened an embassy and began building relationships that would later include Hezbollah operatives receiving Venezuelan passports. Bush was focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. Venezuela was an afterthought. The cost of that neglect? Russia and China spent those years building the infrastructure of influence that would take 2 decades to dismantle. Barack Obama took a different approach. In 2015, he signed Executive Order 13692, declaring Venezuela a national security threat and imposing targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials. The result? Nothing changed. Maduro took power after Chavez died in 2013. The economy collapsed. Inflation hit 1,000,000%. People ate from garbage cans. And Obama's response was more sanctions. Asset freezes on mid-level officials, travel bans on people who never intended to visit Miami anyway. Here's what Obama didn't do. He didn't stop Russian military exercises in the Caribbean. He didn't prevent China from becoming Venezuela's largest creditor. He didn't cut off Cuban intelligence from running Venezuelan security services. In 2013, his own Secretary of State, John Kerry, declared the Monroe Doctrine dead. That wasn't just a diplomatic statement, it was an invitation. Russia heard it, China heard it, Iran heard it. They moved in. In 2019, Trump did something no president had done before. He recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president after Maduro stole an election. He imposed the toughest sanctions in history, not just on individuals, but on Venezuela's entire oil sector. He even floated military options publicly, something his predecessors refused to do. But there was a problem. Guaido had no power, no military support, no control over any institution. Recognizing him was symbolically important, but symbols don't remove dictators. The sanctions hurt Venezuela's economy, but Maduro simply shifted exports to China, Russia, and India through shadow fleets and ship-to-ship transfers. And critically, Trump's first term ended before he could follow through. Joe Biden inherited Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and he dismantled it. In 2022, Biden began easing sanctions. He allowed Chevron to resume operations in Venezuela. He lifted restrictions on oil trading. Why? Because Maduro promised free elections in 2024. You know what happened next. Maduro held the election. He lost by a landslide, possibly 70% to 30%. International observers documented the fraud. The opposition published vote tallies from polling stations across the country, proving their candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, had won. And Maduro simply declared himself the winner anyway. Gonzalez fled to Spain after Maduro issued an arrest warrant accusing him of terrorism. Maria Corina Machado, the woman who actually organized the opposition, went into hiding. And Biden's response? More sanctions on 16 officials. Not on the oil sector, not on PDVSA, not on the revenue streams keeping Maduro in power. Why not? Because Biden officials were worried about oil prices before the November 2024 election. Let me say that clearly. The Biden administration prioritized American gas prices over Venezuelan democracy. They had leverage, they gave it away, and Maduro laughed all the way to his fraudulent inauguration in January 2025. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, he inherited a disaster. Maduro was more entrenched than ever. Cuban intelligence was running Venezuelan security. Hezbollah had built financial networks across the country. Russia had just signed a 20-year strategic partnership treaty with Caracas. China was Venezuela's largest oil customer and creditor. Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan prison gang, was operating in American cities, and 8 million Venezuelan refugees had fled across the hemisphere. Here's what Trump understood that his predecessors didn't. Sanctions don't work against regimes that have alternative buyers. Diplomatic pressure doesn't work against regimes protected by great powers. Recognizing opposition figures doesn't work when those figures have no military support. There is only one language that dictators understand: force. We are reasserting American power. That's not rhetoric, that's a doctrine. For a decade, Russia marketed the S-300 air defense system as the weapon that would make any nation untouchable. They sold it to Iran, Syria, and Venezuela, telling buyers it could track 24 targets simultaneously, engage aircraft at 200 kilometers, and create a no-fly zone against American forces. Venezuela paid approximately $2 billion for S-300 VM anti-2500 systems, Russia's most advanced export variant. Moscow positioned these systems as proof that American air superiority could be defeated. On January 3, 2026, American forces destroyed them in minutes. At La Carota Air Base in Caracas, at least one S-300 system was hit. At Higuerote Airport, another was demolished. The explosion caught on video, the wreckage clearly identifiable. A military analyst described what happened. The S-300 was designed to win a sniper duel by waving a road flare. It shines the world's brightest spotlight on itself. That's a radar that takes an AGM-88E HARM missile to the face. Here's why this matters beyond Venezuela. Every country that bought Russian air defense, Iran, Syria, Algeria, just watched their billion-dollar investment get neutralized by American electronic warfare and precision strikes. The S-300's reputation is destroyed. One defense analyst put it this way: for the next 20 years, every Russian ally using the S-300 from Iran to North Korea is now fighting naked, because we know their system better than they do. That's not just a tactical victory. That's a strategic message to everyone considering Russian military hardware. It doesn't work. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said something extraordinary after the strike. Their whole spy agency was full of Cubans. He wasn't exaggerating. For 2 decades, Cuba's G2 intelligence service didn't just advise Venezuelan security, they ran it. Experts estimate between 5,000 and 15,000 Cuban personnel were stationed in Venezuela at any given time. Not doctors, not educators, intelligence officers, military advisors, security consultants. They controlled SEBIN, Venezuela's secret police. They designed surveillance protocols. They personally guarded Maduro. They ran counterintelligence operations against the opposition. On January 3rd, 32 of them died. Cuba's government confirmed it. 32 members of their armed forces and intelligence services killed in the American strike. Trump told the New York Post, "You know, many Cubans lost their lives last night. They were protecting Maduro. That was not a good move." But the dead are only part of the story. Thousands more are now stranded. They're fleeing back to an island with no electricity, no food, and no money to pay them. The G2's entire Venezuela operation, built over 25 years, is exposed. Their networks are compromised, their operatives are identified, and they're returning to a Cuba that can no longer sustain them. Rubio was explicit about what comes next. The head of the snake is in Havana. That's not metaphor, that's targeting guidance. This is the threat nobody talked about until now. For over 20 years, Hezbollah has operated in Venezuela with the protection of the Venezuelan government, not secretly, openly. In 2012, Congress held hearings titled Hezbollah in Latin America: Implications for U.S. Homeland Security. Witnesses testified that Hezbollah operatives used Venezuelan passports, that they trained recruits on Venezuelan soil, that they ran businesses and safe houses across the country, that Margarita Island had become, in the words of one expert, a safe haven for terrorists and drug smugglers. In 2020, the Department of Justice indicted Maduro himself on narco-terrorism charges. The indictment named Hezbollah explicitly as part of a conspiracy involving dissidents of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, drug cartels in Mexico, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Syria, and the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah. This wasn't speculation. This was a federal grand jury. Here's how the money flowed. Venezuela shipped gold to Iran, sometimes directly, sometimes through Turkey. Iran shipped that gold to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah used it to fund operations against Israel and American interests. In 2023, Israeli intelligence confirmed that Venezuelan gold was being transferred to Hezbollah through Iranian intermediaries. Venezuela wasn't just a dictatorship. It was a node in a global terrorism financing network. And for 25 years, American presidents knew it and did nothing effective to stop it. Rubio was unambiguous. In the 21st century, under the Trump administration, we are not going to have a country like Venezuela in our own hemisphere, in the sphere of control and the crossroads for Hezbollah, for Iran, and for every other malign influence in the world. That's just not going to exist. No more Iran-Hezbollah presence there. That's not aspiration. With Maduro in custody and American forces controlling key infrastructure, that's implementation. Throughout 2024 and 2025, Americans heard a name that most had never encountered: Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan prison gang that had spread across South America and into American cities. In Aurora, Colorado, viral footage showed armed men entering apartment buildings. Local officials initially downplayed the threat, then acknowledged the gang's presence. In New York, police linked the gang to shootings, thefts, forced prostitution, and extortion. In El Paso, hotels became transit houses for gang operations. The Department of Justice indicted over 260 Tren de Aragua members since January 2025. Attorney General Pam Bondi called them a ruthless, highly organized, and rapidly expanding foreign terrorist organization that thrives on chaos and human suffering. But here's what most people don't understand. Tren de Aragua didn't just originate in Venezuela. It operated with the knowledge and, according to some experts, the coordination of Venezuelan military intelligence and the Cartel de los Sones, a narco-trafficking network run by senior Venezuelan military officers.
This wasn't random crime. This was state-enabled, transnational, organized crime. And when Trump captured Maduro, indicted since 2020 for leading this narco-terrorism conspiracy, he didn't just remove a dictator. He removed the man at the organizational chart. Trump invoked Tren de Aragua specifically in his justification for the strike. Maduro sent savage and murderous bangs, including the bloodthirsty prison gang Tren de Aragua, to terrorize American communities nationwide. Agree or disagree with the characterization, the strategic logic is clear. You don't defeat a transnational criminal organization by arresting foot soldiers in American cities. You decapitate it at the source. In 2008, Russian T-160 nuclear-capable bombers flew to Venezuela for joint military exercises. It was the first time since the Cold War that Russian strategic aircraft had operated in the Western Hemisphere. Moscow's message was unmistakable. We can project power into America's backyard. Since then, Russia has sold Venezuela $14.5 billion in weapons, including Su-30 fighter jets, Mi-35 attack helicopters, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. They sent military advisors and technicians. They conducted naval exercises in the Caribbean. They positioned forces that could theoretically threaten Caribbean shipping lanes and even the American mainland. On June 3, 2024, just months before the strike, Russian naval vessels transited to Cuba in what was widely interpreted as a warning to the Biden administration. The 2025 Strategic Partnership Treaty between Putin and Maduro wasn't just about oil. It committed both nations to military coordination, intelligence sharing, and a common front against Western pressure. Venezuela was becoming Russia's Cuba 2.0, a strategic foothold 1,500 miles from Miami. Caracas to Miami, 1,374 miles. Caracas to Houston, 1,991 miles. Caracas to New Orleans, 1,821 miles. These aren't abstract distances. These are strike ranges, reconnaissance ranges, power projection ranges. On January 3rd, Trump erased 20 years of Russian military positioning in a single night. The S-300s are destroyed. The air bases are cratered. The military advisors are dead or fleeing. And Moscow? They issued a statement demanding Maduro's release. They didn't do anything else, because they can't. Iran's presence in Venezuela went beyond oil swaps and gold shipments. In the years leading up to the strike, Venezuela began developing drones using Iranian-trained experts overseen directly by the Islamic Republic. Venezuela's state airline, Conviasa, was implicated in Iran's global illicit arms network, ferrying operatives, equipment, and cargo between Caracas, Damascus, and Tehran on regular flights. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, had established a presence that U.S. officials described as a command and control element in Caracas. In 2021, U.S. authorities disrupted a plot to kidnap an Iranian journalist from her home in New York and transport her to Venezuela, then to Iran. Think about that. Iran was using Venezuela as a transit point for operations against American citizens on American soil.
Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar called Venezuela a nexus for criminals building narco-terror alliances with the Middle East terror states. He said Venezuela serves as a base for Hezbollah terror operatives and hosts an Iranian weapons production facility. After Maduro's capture, Sa'ar commended Trump, saying, "At this historic moment, Israel stands alongside the freedom-loving Venezuelan people who have suffered under Maduro's illegal tyranny." Iran's $2 billion investment in Venezuela is now stranded. Their drone development program is disrupted. Their transit routes are exposed. Their Hezbollah financing channels are under direct threat. A former Iranian lawmaker warned that Tehran should have learned from Syria, where investments became unrecoverable overnight after Assad's fall. Venezuela is the same story. Now let's talk about the money. Between 2006 and 2017, Russia poured $17 billion into Venezuela: loans, credit lines, prepayments for oil, and equity investments. Rosneft, Russia's state oil giant, became Maduro's financial lifeline. When China stopped lending, Rosneft kept the cash flowing. In 2014 alone, Rosneft provided PDVSA with $6.5 billion in loans and advance payments. In exchange, Russia received stakes in Junin 6, Petro Managas, Petro Pereja, Petro Victoria, Petro Miranda, and Bocaran oil projects. They got 49.9% of Citgo, America's seventh largest refiner, as collateral for a $1.5 billion loan. They gained political leverage in OPEC negotiations and a strategic partner willing to host Russian military assets. By 2017, the debt burden was so large that Putin agreed to defer principal repayments to 2024 to 2027, essentially acknowledging the loans would never be repaid on schedule. The Strategic Partnership Treaty signed in May 2025 extended oil exploration agreements through 2041. All of it is now worthless. A new Venezuelan government, operating under American supervision, has no obligation to honor contracts signed by Maduro. The oil field stakes are under review. The Citgo collateral is tied up in American courts, where creditors are fighting over $19 billion in claims. The military cooperation is terminated. The strategic positioning is gone. A former Russian political scientist told reporters, years of investment and influence can be erased, not gradually, but in a single geopolitical moment. He called it a humiliating lesson for Moscow's elite. If Russia lost billions, China lost everything. Between 2007 and 2017, China extended over $60 billion in loans to Venezuela, 53% of all Chinese lending to Latin America. When you include financial assistance, infrastructure investments, and restructured debt, total Chinese exposure approaches $105 billion. $105 billion.
2006, $2 billion. 2007, $7 billion. 2009, $8 billion. 2010, $27 billion. The loans were backed by oil shipments. Venezuela promised up to 1 million barrels per day. But as production collapsed from 3.5 million barrels to under 900,000, Venezuela couldn't deliver. By 2016, China stopped issuing new loans entirely, focusing instead on restructuring existing debt. Venezuela was shipping 330,000 barrels per day to China just to service interest, not principal, not new purchases, just keeping creditors at bay. Within 24 hours of Maduro's capture, China's financial regulator ordered all major banks to report their Venezuelan exposure. CNPC's oil field rights, including 15 mature fields in the Orinoco Belt, are now subject to review. The Belt and Road flagship in Latin America has failed. And here's the most painful detail. Hours before American forces snatched Maduro, he was meeting with Chu Shaoqi, Xi Jinping's special envoy for Latin America. The delegation included China's ambassador, the director of the Latin American department, and senior diplomats. No one knows if they made it out before the strike began. Trump's message to Beijing couldn't be clearer. Your investments in this hemisphere are not safe. Cuba didn't just lose money. Cuba may lose everything. For 2 decades, Cuba shipped 35,000 to 50,000 barrels of oil per day to Havana, essentially free, in exchange for intelligence services. That oil kept Cuba's lights on, powered its hospitals, ran its factories. And Cuba did something else with that oil. They sold the surplus on international markets, generating hard currency for food and medicine imports. On January 3rd, that supply went to zero. American forces now control Venezuelan ports. The oil embargo is total. Trump told reporters Cuba is ready to fall. I think it's just going to fall. I don't think we need any action. Looks like it's going down. It's going down for the count. Cuba requires 110,000 to 120,000 barrels of oil for basic needs. They were getting less than 30,000 before the strike. Now they're getting nothing. Russia can't help. They're drained by Ukraine. China won't help. They've already cut credit. Mexico sent emergency fuel in late 2025, but Trump has threatened tariffs on anyone who interferes. The 15,000 Cuban intelligence operatives who ran Venezuela's security state, they're fleeing back to an island with no electricity, no food, and no money to pay them. Disgruntled, unpaid security personnel returning from a failed operation is a classic recipe for regime instability. The Castro-Diaz-Canel regime survived the Soviet collapse by finding Venezuela. They won't find another lifeline. Iran invested approximately $2 billion in Venezuela over 2 decades. Joint automobile manufacturing halted. Housing construction, 23,000 units planned. Status unclear. Agricultural ventures, 1 million hectares allegedly allocated, never confirmed. Banking cooperation, frozen. Oil swap arrangements, blocked. The gas for gold scheme moved hundreds of millions of dollars between Tehran and Caracas, with some of that gold ending up with Hezbollah. A former Iranian lawmaker warned Tehran to urgently clarify the legal status of more than $2 billion in claims against Venezuela. His warning? Look at Syria. When Assad fell, Iranian investments became worthless overnight. Venezuela is the same pattern. The head of the Iran-China Chamber of Commerce claimed Iranian money has already been withdrawn. But you can't withdraw factories. You can't withdraw infrastructure projects. You can't withdraw 2 decades of positioning. It's gone. Turkey's involvement reveals how deep the corruption ran. In 2018, Turkish-Venezuelan trade exploded from $200 million to over $1.1 billion, almost entirely gold. Ankara imported $900 million in Venezuelan gold, claiming it was for refining. The gold never returned. Turkish entities bought the refined gold and transferred funds to Venezuelan offshore accounts, a nearly $1 billion sanctions evasion scheme. At the center, the Akhlachi Group, a Turkish conglomerate whose chairman was personally introduced to Maduro during a 2018 state visit. In 2019, Venezuela's sanctioned vice president for economic affairs, Tarek El-Aissami, personally visited the Akhlachi refinery in Shahroum. The same El-Aissami sanctioned by the U.S. since 2007 for narcotics trafficking and ties to Hezbollah. Turkey also became a cocaine transit hub. Seizures spiked after 2020, particularly through the port of Mersin. In 2021, an exiled Turkish crime figure alleged that politically connected individuals facilitated drug trafficking between Venezuela and Turkey. After Maduro's capture, Erdogan has said nothing critical of Washington. Senator Graham noted that Maduro could have been in Turkey, suggesting a deal for exile was on the table before the strike. That deal didn't happen. Now, Maduro is in American custody, and he knows everything about the gold shipments, the trafficking routes, the offshore accounts. How much will he tell prosecutors? Let's be specific about what Trump's team accomplished. Operation Absolute Resolve involved 150-plus aircraft, including fighters, bombers, surveillance planes, and helicopters. The Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the USS Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, approximately 15,000 deployed personnel, months of CIA intelligence gathering inside Venezuela, a source close to Maduro tracking his movements in real time. The operation began at 2 a.m. local time. By dawn, Maduro was on an American warship. No American combat deaths. 2 soldiers injured, neither life-threatening. Trump called it a brilliant operation. A lot of good planning and a lot of great troops and great people. Compare this to every failed regime change attempt of the past 50 years. Iraq required 150,000 troops and a decade of occupation. Afghanistan required 20 years and ended in humiliating withdrawal. Libya became a failed state. Syria remains divided. Venezuela took 1 night. Trump didn't rush this. The buildup began in August 2025 with naval deployments framed as counter-narcotics operations. September brought the first boat strikes against alleged drug traffickers. October saw military exercises expand throughout the Caribbean. November brought the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. December escalated to seizing oil tankers and implementing a naval quarantine. Throughout, Maduro was offered off-ramps. Reuters reported Venezuela proposed a deal. Maduro would resign in 3 years, transfer power to Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, and Venezuela would welcome U.S. investors while loosening ties to Russia and Iran. Trump rejected it. He was also offered a deal where Maduro would go into exile in Turkey. Trump rejected that too. Why? Because exile deals leave dictators free to plot returns. They leave stolen billions untouched. They leave justice unserved. Trump wanted Maduro in a courtroom. He got him. Here's what every American adversary learned on January 3rd. Your proxies are not protected. Your investments are not safe. Your military hardware doesn't work. And when America decides to act in its own hemisphere, no one can stop it. Russia issued statements. They did nothing. China expressed shock. They did nothing. Iran condemned the strike as flagrant aggression. They did nothing. Because they can't. Russia is bleeding in Ukraine. They can't project force to the Caribbean. China depends on American trade. They won't risk sanctions for a failed bet. Iran just watched their nuclear program get degraded. They're in no position to escalate. For 20 years, these nations assumed the Monroe Doctrine was dead. They assumed America was too distracted, too divided, too committed to multilateralism to act unilaterally in their own backyard. Trump proved them wrong. Let's talk about what America gains. Venezuela holds 303 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any nation on earth. At $60 per barrel, that's approximately $17 trillion in the ground. Trump was explicit. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, and start making money for the country. We'll be selling large amounts of oil to other countries. It won't cost us anything because the money coming out of the ground is very substantial. Yes, Venezuelan infrastructure is destroyed. PDVSA says pipelines haven't been updated in 50 years. Restoring full production will cost $58 billion and take a decade. But American companies have the capital, they have the technology, and now they have access. ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, the same companies nationalized by Chavez, are positioned to return. Trump called that nationalization the largest theft of property in the history of our country. Now, he's taking it back.
Trump didn't hide what this represents. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. They now call it the Don Roe Doctrine. We've superseded the Monroe Doctrine by a lot, by a real lot. The administration's national security strategy, released in November 2025, explicitly declared a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. That's not rhetoric, that's a doctrine. And on January 3rd, it was implemented. Russia lost. $17 billion in loans and credit lines, unrecoverable. Oil field stakes worth billions more, under review. $2 billion S-300 air defense systems, destroyed. Military positioning 1,500 miles from Miami, eliminated. 260 bilateral agreements, worthless. Strategic leverage against America, gone. Reputation of military exports, devastated. China lost. $60 to $105 billion in loans and investments, largest write-off in history. CNPC oil field operations, under review. Belt and Road flagship, failed. Strategic positioning, erased. Largest debtor, in American hands. Credibility as a reliable partner, damaged. Cuba lost. 35,000 to 50,000 barrels per day of free oil, gone overnight. Hard currency from oil resales, eliminated. 15,000 intelligence operatives, stranded. 32 confirmed dead in the strike. G2 intelligence networks, exposed and dismantled. 25 years of influence operations, destroyed. Possibly the regime itself. Iran lost. $2 billion in infrastructure investments, stranded. Oil swap arrangements, blocked. Hezbollah financing channels, exposed. Drone development program, disrupted. IRGC presence in Western Hemisphere, eliminated. Gold smuggling routes, shut down. Turkey, lost. $900 million plus in gold arrangements, exposed. Drug trafficking networks, under investigation. Erdogan's adamant ambitions in Latin America, finished. Sanctions evasion operations in prosecutors' hands. Hezbollah, lost. 25 years of Venezuelan infrastructure, destroyed. Financing channels, disrupted. Safe haven, eliminated. Command and control elements, scattered. Tren de Aragua, lost. State protection, removed. Leadership infrastructure, under indictment. Revenue streams, threatened. Impunity, ended. Trump won. Control over 303 billion barrels of oil, $17 trillion. Destruction of Russian military positioning. Elimination of Hezbollah infrastructure. Decapitation of Tren de Aragua decapitation. Collapse of Cuban intelligence networks. Humiliation of every adversary who bet on Maduro. Restoration of American hemispheric dominance, a foreign policy legacy that will define his presidency. But there's something else Trump won that doesn't fit on a scoreboard. Proof of concept. For decades, foreign policy experts insisted that American unilateralism was impossible, counterproductive, and dangerous. Trump proved them wrong. He didn't need a UN resolution. He didn't need NATO consensus. He didn't need years of diplomatic preparation. He needed Delta Force, carrier strike groups, and the will to act. I've spent this video explaining what Trump accomplished. Now, let me be honest about the risks. Risk 1. The regime is still intact. Maduro is gone, but 99.9% of Chavismo remains. Diosdado Cabello, Maduro's enforcer, the man who controls the military, is now Minister of Defense and Interior. The colectivos, armed civilian militias, haven't been disarmed. Sabin, the secret police, still exists. The Constituent Assembly still controls the legislature.
Removing one man doesn't remove a system. Risk 2, the transition question. Trump said America will run Venezuela temporarily. The challenge is what comes next. Maria Corina Machado has international acclaim, including a Nobel Prize, but Trump assessed she lacks the internal infrastructure to govern a country this fractured. Edmundo Gonzalez won the 2024 election, but has been in exile in Spain, disconnected from events on the ground. Trump's choice to work with Delcy Rodriguez is transactional. She knows where the levers of power are. She controls the bureaucracy, and she's cooperating. It's the difference between idealism and operational reality. The question isn't whether it's clean. The question is whether it works. Risk 3, regional backlash. Brazil condemned the strike as a dangerous precedent. Mexico called it a violation of sovereignty. Chile suspended intelligence sharing. Colombia suspended intelligence sharing. Chile's Gabriel Boric, a leftist who opposed Maduro, still condemned the operation. These aren't enemies, they're neighbors, and they're worried about precedent. Risk 4, the international order. For 80 years, the post-World War II order rested on one principle. You don't invade sovereign nations and abduct their leaders. America just broke that rule. Russia cites sovereignty to justify its invasion of Ukraine. China cites sovereignty to threaten Taiwan. What argument does America have now? But here's the counter-argument. The international order protected Maduro for 11 years. While diplomats negotiated, children starved. While sanctions were debated, 8 million people fled. While the ICC investigated, opposition leaders were imprisoned and tortured. The rules-based international order didn't save Venezuela. It protected a dictator. Sometimes the only answer to tyranny is force. Sometimes the only language dictators understand is power. Sometimes waiting for perfect conditions means waiting forever. Trump decided he wasn't going to wait. Here's where we are. Nicolás Maduro sits in a Manhattan detention center, facing charges that could mean life in prison. His wife, Celia Flores, sits in an adjacent cell. Delcy Rodriguez, the dictator's daughter, the woman whose father was tortured to death by Venezuelan intelligence in 1976 for kidnapping an American businessman, is now running Venezuela under American supervision. Russia has lost $17 billion and their foothold in the Western Hemisphere. China has lost up to $105 billion and their largest debtor in Latin America. Cuba is on the verge of collapse. Iran's investments are stranded. Hezbollah's Western Hemisphere operation is dismantled. Turkey's gold arrangements are exposed. Tren de Aragua's leadership is indicted. And Donald Trump controls the largest oil reserves on Earth. For 25 years, American presidents gave speeches about Venezuela. George W. Bush condemned Chavez, but focused on Iraq. Barack Obama imposed sanctions, but declared the Monroe Doctrine dead. Donald Trump, in his first term, recognized Guaido, but couldn't finish the job. Joe Biden lifted sanctions and got nothing in return. Then Trump came back, and in one night, he did what 5 presidents couldn't or wouldn't do. Was it legal? Many scholars say no. Was it moral? That depends on whether you think dictators have a right to rule while their people starve. Was it wise? Only time will tell. But was it effective? Look at the scoreboard. 50 years from now, historians will debate whether January 3, 2026 was a liberation or an invasion. What they won't debate is this: it was decisive. For the first time in a quarter century, someone actually did something about Venezuela, and that someone is sitting in Mar-a-Lago. That's the story. Subscribe if you want to follow what happens next. because this is far from over.